The sun beat down mercilessly on Miami's glittering coastline as Shaquille O'Neal, dressed in casual beach wear, strolled along the pristine shoreline. At 7 feet 1 inch tall, the NBA legend's imposing figure cast a long shadow across the sand. It was supposed to be just another peaceful Sunday afternoon, but fate had different plans. 3 miles away, in the exclusive Palm Beach Gardens neighborhood, Melania Trump was experiencing an unusually difficult day. 8 months pregnant with what would be the couple's second child, she had decided to take a short walk in their private garden despite the scorching heat. The former First Lady's security detail kept a respectful distance, allowing her a rare moment of solitude among the meticulously maintained rose bushes. Nobody could have predicted the chain of events that would unfold in the next few hours, bringing together two of America's most recognizable personalities in an extraordinary twist of circumstance. The first sign of trouble came when Melania felt a sharp pain in her lower abdomen. She had experienced Braxton Hicks contractions before, but this felt different. More intense. More urgent. The baby wasn't due for another month, and Donald was away on business in New York, handling some urgent matters related to his latest business venture. Meanwhile, Shaq was wrapping up his beachside walk when his phone buzzed. It was his friend Mike, a retired Secret Service agent who now worked private security for high-profile clients in South Florida. "Shaq, we've got a situation," Mike's voice crackled through the speaker. "Mrs. Trump's gone into early labor, and we're stuck in gridlock. There's a massive accident on I-95, and emergency services are backed up for miles." Shaq's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. Few people knew that before his basketball career, he had trained as a reserve police officer and maintained various law enforcement credentials throughout his playing days. He had even completed basic emergency medical response training as part of his commitment to public service. "Send me the location," Shaq replied without hesitation, already jogging toward his custom Ford F-650 Super truck, parked nearby. The vehicle, which he'd specifically modified for emergency situations, was equipped with lights and sirens, a precaution that many had questioned but would prove invaluable today. As he navigated through Palm Beach's winding roads, Shaq's mind raced through his emergency medical training. He remembered the key points about handling emergency births, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. His massive hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he thought about the responsibility that fate had suddenly thrust upon him. Back at the Trump residence, Melania's security team had helped her inside, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The contractions were coming faster now, and the nearest hospital might as well have been on the moon given the gridlocked traffic situation. The head of security, a veteran agent named Thompson, was running out of options when he heard the distinctive rumble of a massive engine approaching the gates. Through the security cameras, they watched as Shaq's unmistakable truck pulled up to the entrance. The basketball legend's voice came through clear on the intercom, "This is Shaquille O'Neal. I heard you folks might need some help." Thompson had served 3 presidents and thought he'd seen everything, but the sight of Shaquille O'Neal arriving like a guardian angel in a moment of crisis was something new entirely. After quick verification of his credentials and a series of rapid security protocols, the gates swung open. As Shaq strode through the mansion's marble halls, his footsteps echoing off the high ceilings, he could hear sharp breaths coming from the main living room. He found Melania surrounded by concerned security personnel, her face etched with pain but maintaining remarkable composure. "Mrs. Trump," Shaq said, his deep voice surprisingly gentle, "I know this isn't exactly what you planned for today, but I'm here to help. My truck can get through traffic that would stop an ambulance, and I've got emergency training. What do you say we get you to the hospital?" Melania looked up at the towering figure before her, and despite the pain and uncertainty of the moment, she couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of the situation. Here was Shaquille O'Neal, basketball legend and occasional rapper, about to come to her rescue. "I've seen you play basketball, Mr. O'Neal," she managed between breaths, her accent more pronounced under stress. "I trust you're driving more than your free throws." The joke broke the tension in the room, and even the stone-faced security personnel cracked smiles. Shaq's legendary laugh boomed through the mansion as he helped prepare for the urgent journey ahead. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most extraordinary days in their lives, a story that would soon capture the imagination of the entire nation. The next few minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance as Shaq's police training kicked in. He quickly coordinated with the security team to help Melania into his massive truck, which suddenly seemed like the perfect vehicle for this unprecedented situation. The custom-raised suspension meant she wouldn't have to climb too high, and the spacious interior provided enough room for both her and a security officer to sit comfortably. "Ladies first," Shaq said with a reassuring smile, extending his massive hand to help her into the vehicle. Two security teams split up, one would follow in their SUV, while another stayed behind to coordinate with local authorities and medical personnel. Thompson, the head of security, joined them in Shaq's truck, maintaining protocol even in this unusual circumstance. As they pulled out of the palatial driveway, Shaq's mind was already mapping out alternative routes. Years of navigating Miami's backstreets for early morning practices and late-night games had given him an intimate knowledge of the area's hidden shortcuts and lesser-known paths. "How are you holding up, Mrs. Trump?" Shaq asked, glancing in the rearview mirror while smoothly navigating the first turn. Melania sat in the back seat, her breathing measured but strained, one hand resting protectively over her belly. "I've been better," she replied with remarkable composure, managing a small smile. "But please, call me Melania. I think we're past formalities when you're driving me to the hospital." The first real challenge came as they approached the main thoroughfare. True to Mike's warning, traffic was backed up for miles. Through the windshield, they could see a sea of red brake lights stretching toward the horizon. The afternoon sun reflected off countless vehicles, creating a metallic maze that would have stopped any normal rescue attempt. But Shaq wasn't driving any normal vehicle, and this wasn't a normal situation. He activated the emergency lights he'd installed, lights that many had mocked as unnecessary for a civilian vehicle. "Hold on tight," he announced, carefully maneuvering onto the wide shoulder of the road. His truck's elevated position gave him a clear view of potential hazards. As they passed the gridlocked traffic, people began to notice the unusual sight. Cell phones emerged from car windows as onlookers tried to capture video of the distinctive truck with its even more distinctive driver. Word started spreading through social media almost immediately: Shaquille O'Neal was up to something big in Miami. Inside the truck, Melania's contractions were intensifying. Thompson maintained constant communication with the hospital, updating them on their position and her condition. The air conditioning worked overtime against the Florida heat, and Shaq had switched on some gentle classical music, a choice that surprised both his passengers. "Mozart helps me focus," he explained, catching their questioning looks. "Used to listen to it before big games. Today's just a different kind of game." They were making good progress until they hit an unexpected obstacle. Road construction had closed off their planned route. Without missing a beat, Shaq made a quick decision. "I know a way through the old industrial district," he said, taking a sharp turn. "Used to practice free throws at a warehouse gym down there. Not the prettiest route, but it'll get us there." As they wound through the lesser-traveled streets, Melania's security team continued to clear their path ahead, coordinating with local law enforcement. The story was spreading rapidly across news channels and social media platforms. #Shaq to the rescue was already trending on Twitter, though few knew the real stakes of his mission. Their unlikely convoy attracted attention from locals who weren't used to seeing such traffic in their quiet neighborhood. Children playing basketball in driveways stopped to wave, and Shaq, despite the urgency of their situation, managed to honk and wave back. "Never too busy to acknowledge the kids," he said with a grin. The moment of levity was interrupted by a sharp intake of breath from the back seat. Melania's contractions were getting closer together. Thompson looked increasingly concerned as he relayed this information to the hospital. "How much longer?" Melania asked, her accent thickening with stress. Shaq checked his mental map. 15 minutes to the hospital if we take the tunnel, but it might be backed up. 25 if we go around, but it's a sure thing. I vote tunnel, Melania said firmly, then added with unexpected humor, I trust your instincts, except for free throws. That's the second free throw joke today, Shaq chuckled, his deep laugh filling the truck. But I'll let it slide since you're in labor. As they approached the tunnel entrance, Shaq's gamble seemed to pay off, traffic was light. But halfway through, they encountered an unexpected sight, a stalled delivery truck was causing a slowdown. This was the kind of situation that could quickly turn into a full tunnel blockage. Shaq assessed the situation quickly. The tunnel had 2 lanes, and the stalled truck was hugging the right wall. There was just enough space on the left, but it would be tight, very tight. He thought about his days on the court, where spatial awareness meant the difference between a smooth drive to the basket and a charging foul. Everyone hold steady, he announced, his voice calm but focused. With the precision of someone used to maneuvering his large frame through tight spaces, Shaq began to guide the massive truck through the narrow gap. The clearance on either side couldn't have been more than a few inches. Time seemed to slow down as they inched past the stalled vehicle. The echo of their engine bounced off the tunnel walls, and the fluorescent lights created a strobe effect that added to the tension. Then, suddenly, they were through, emerging into the bright Florida sunlight on the other side. A collective sigh of relief filled the truck's cabin, but they weren't done yet. The hospital was now in sight, its modern glass facade reflecting the late afternoon sun. As they pulled up to the emergency entrance, a medical team was already waiting, alerted by Thompson's updates. The next few minutes were a blur of activity as hospital staff helped Melania onto a wheelchair. Before they wheeled her in, she turned to Shaq, who was standing by his truck, his imposing figure drawing curious looks from hospital staff and patients alike. "Thank you," she said simply, but her eyes conveyed much more. Shaq gave her a respectful nod. "Go bring that baby into the world," he replied with a warm smile. "And remember, if it's a boy, Shaquille is a great name." As the medical team whisked Melania inside, Thompson stayed behind briefly. "Mr. O'Neill," he said, extending his hand, "that was some remarkable driving." "Just doing what needed to be done," Shaq replied, shaking the security chief's hand. "But something tells me this story isn't over yet." Indeed, as the hospital doors closed behind Melania, news helicopters were already circling overhead, and Shaq to the rescue had become the #1 trending topic nationwide. The real question was, what would happen next? Within minutes of Melania's arrival at the hospital, the story exploded across every major news network. The sight of Shaquille O'Neal's unmistakable truck parked outside the emergency entrance had set off a media frenzy that would soon reach unprecedented levels. Journalists began gathering outside the hospital, their satellite trucks forming an impromptu media village in the parking lot. Inside, Shaq had moved to the waiting area, his large frame making the standard-sized hospital chair look like children's furniture. He'd been asked to stay by Thompson, who recognized that having him nearby might help manage the growing media circus outside. The basketball legend was scrolling through his phone, amazed at how quickly the story had spread. "You're trending higher than that time you fell on live TV," chuckled Mike, his friend from security who had initially called him for help. Mike had arrived at the hospital and joined Shaq in the waiting area, bringing him a much-needed coffee that looked tiny in his massive hands. "Man, social media is wild," Shaq replied, showing Mike his screen. "Someone already made a meme of my truck with cartoon storks flying around it." He paused as a new message popped up on his phone. It was from Donald Trump himself. Meanwhile, in New York, Donald Trump had been in the middle of a high-stakes business meeting when he received the news about Melania. His immediate reaction was captured by those present: complete silence, followed by a broad smile as he heard about Shaq's involvement. He immediately excused himself and headed for his private helicopter, but not before sending a message to the basketball legend who had come to his wife's rescue. Back at the hospital, Shaq read the message aloud to Mike. "Shaq, you're the biggest hero. Taking care of my beautiful Melania when I couldn't be there. Nobody handles pressure like you do, except maybe me. On my way now. Thank you." Classic Donald, Shaq laughed, his deep voice echoing through the waiting room. Several nurses nearby tried to hide their smiles as they pretended not to eavesdrop on the conversation. The hospital's PR team was working overtime, coordinating with both the Trump team and Shaq's representatives to manage the situation. Outside, the crowd of reporters had grown, and social media was ablaze with speculation and commentary. What had started as a simple act of helping someone in need had transformed into one of the most talked about stories of the year. Local food trucks, sensing an opportunity, began setting up near the media encampment. One clever vendor had already renamed their cheese sandwich, the Shaq Attack Stack, and was doing brisk business among the gathered journalists and curious onlookers. Inside the hospital, life continued as normal as possible under the extraordinary circumstances. Staff members maintained their professional composure, though many couldn't resist stealing glances at the NBA legend as they passed by. One young doctor, barely containing his excitement, approached Shaq with a medical chart held close to his chest. "Mr. O'Neal," he began nervously, "I just wanted to say, what you did today, my dad used to take me to watch you play when I was a kid. You were my hero then, and what you did today, you're still a hero." Shaq stood up, making the young doctor step back in surprise at his full height, and placed a friendly hand on his shoulder. "First, call me Shaq," he said warmly. "And second, the real heroes are medical professionals like you who save lives every day. I just did some fancy driving." The moment was interrupted by a commotion from the hallway. Donald Trump had arrived. His helicopter had landed on the hospital's rooftop helipad minutes earlier, and now he burst into the waiting area with his characteristic energy, followed by a collection of Secret Service agents and staff members. "Shaq!" Trump called out, making a beeline for the basketball star. "You're fired." "Just kidding, you don't work for me. But if you did, I'd give you a raise." His distinctive laugh filled the room as he approached Shaq with his hand extended. The two men shook hands, creating an instantly viral photo opportunity that someone captured on their phone, the 7'1" basketball legend and the former president, both grinning broadly in a hospital waiting room. The image would appear on every news website within minutes. "How is she?" Trump asked, his public persona dropping slightly to reveal genuine concern. "The doctors say everything's progressing normally," Shaq replied. "She's in good hands. And she made some pretty good jokes about my free throw shooting on the way here." Trump laughed again. "That's my Melania. Always with the sense of humor. Did you know she's watched every NBA Finals since moving to America? She probably knows your stats better than you do." As the two men continued their conversation, the hospital staff watched in amazement. It was a scene that nobody could have predicted, two of America's most recognizable figures, casually chatting in a hospital waiting room, brought together by an extraordinary set of circumstances. Outside, the crowd had grown even larger. News of Trump's arrival had brought more media attention, and local residents were gathering just to be part of the unusual scene. Police had set up barriers to maintain order, and someone had started an impromptu tailgate party in the parking lot. Social media continued to explode with updates. The story was being covered in multiple languages across the globe, with hashtag #ShaqToTheRescue trending in countries where basketball wasn't even a popular sport. Memes and jokes flooded the internet, but most comments focused on the heartwarming nature of the situation, how an unexpected emergency had brought out the best in people. Back in the waiting room, Shaq's phone buzzed again. This time it was Charles Barkley, his friend and fellow NBA commentator. "Only you would turn a regular Tuesday into a national event. Inside the NBA is going to be fun this week." As Trump was being briefed by the medical team, Shaq decided to step out to address the media briefly. The hospital's PR team had requested his help in managing the situation, knowing his natural charm and media experience would help calm the circus-like atmosphere outside. As he walked through the hospital corridors, staff members and patients smiled and waved. A group of children from the pediatric ward, who had been watching the excitement from their window, pressed their faces against the glass as he passed. Shaq, never one to disappoint young fans, gave them his signature big smile and wave. Just before reaching the hospital entrance, he paused to straighten his clothes and gather his thoughts. He knew that whatever he said next would be broadcast across the world. But more importantly, he wanted to make sure the focus stayed on what really mattered, the safe delivery of a new life into the world. The hospital doors slid open, and camera flashes exploded like stars. As Shaq stepped into the fading Florida sunlight, he couldn't help but think about how a simple decision to help someone in need had turned into something much bigger. But then again, everything about Shaquille O'Neal had always been larger than life. The sea of reporters surged forward as Shaq approached the hastily assembled podium outside the hospital. Camera lights created an artificial dawn in the growing dusk, and microphones sprouted like steel flowers before him. Despite having faced the media countless times during his basketball career, this felt different. This wasn't about points scored or championships won, this was about human connection and being in the right place at the right time. "Good evening, everyone," Shaq began, his deep voice carrying naturally across the crowd. "First, I want to thank the amazing staff here at the hospital who are doing the real important work. I'm just the delivery driver who knew a few shortcuts." His characteristic humor earned warm laughter from the assembled press. As Shaq fielded questions, the story took on new dimensions. Reporters were particularly interested in the details of the drive, especially the tight squeeze through the tunnel. "Let's just say," Shaq grinned, "all those years of getting through double teams in the paint came in handy." Inside the hospital, the TV in the waiting room was tuned to Shaq's impromptu press conference. Donald Trump watched with approval, nodding at Shaq's handling of the media. "That's what I call presidential material right there," he commented to no one in particular, already imagining future campaign possibilities. The press conference was interrupted by an unexpected arrival. A food delivery truck from Shaq's restaurant in Miami had pulled up, loaded with meals for the hospital staff, waiting media, and gathered crowd. "Can't have people going hungry on my watch," Shaq explained when asked about it. "My mama taught me to always take care of the people around you." Meanwhile, social media had taken the story in fascinating new directions. Videos of people attempting the Shaq Rescue Challenge, trying to navigate toy trucks through impossibly narrow spaces, were going viral. NBA teams were posting throwback clips of Shaq's most impressive drives to the basket, comparing them to his drive to the hospital. The WWE had tweeted an old clip of Shaq's wrestling appearance with the caption, "From the ring to the rescue. At Shaq always delivers." Even NASA got in on the action, posting, "We might need at Shaq's navigation skills for our next Mars mission. #Shaq to the rescue." Back at the podium, Shaq was handling questions with his trademark mix of humor and sincerity. A reporter asked if he was scared at any point during the rescue. "The only scary thing," he replied with a straight face, "was thinking about having to explain to my insurance company why I was using police lights on my personal vehicle." As the laughter subsided, a more serious question came from the back of the crowd: "What made you decide to help when you got that call?" Shaq's expression became thoughtful. "You know, people keep asking me that, like it's some big decision. But it wasn't. Someone needed help, I could help, so I did. That's all there is to it. We spend too much time thinking about what divides us, politics, sports teams, whatever. But at the end of the day, we're all just people who sometimes need a little help from each other." His words resonated immediately. Within minutes, #ShaqWisdom was trending alongside #Shaq to the rescue. Political commentators from both sides of the aisle were praising his simple but powerful message about unity and helping others. Inside the hospital, things were progressing well with Melania's labor, though details were being kept private. The medical team had been selected carefully, and security was tight on the maternity floor. Still, the excitement was palpable throughout the building. The hospital's cafeteria had become an impromptu gathering place for staff members ending their shifts, all eager to discuss their part in the unfolding story. One nurse was excitedly telling anyone who would listen about how she had helped wheel in extra chairs to accommodate Shaq's frame in the waiting room. Outside, the crowd had continued to grow. Local food trucks were doing brisk business, and someone had set up a basketball hoop in the parking lot. Children were taking turns trying to imitate Shaq's famous dunks, while their parents shared stories about watching him play during his NBA days. The atmosphere was festive but respectful. Everyone understood they were still at a hospital. The police presence was light, as the crowd seemed to be managing itself with unexpected consideration. Officers on the scene reported that it was one of the most orderly large gatherings they'd ever supervised. As the evening wore on, more celebrities began arriving at the hospital. Charles Barkley had flown in, ostensibly to cover the story for Inside the NBA, but really to give his friend a hard time in person. Only Shaq could turn a baby delivery into a three-ring circus, he announced to the cameras as he arrived. The story had taken on a life of its own, becoming more than just a tale about a famous athlete helping a former First Lady. It had touched something in the public consciousness, a reminder of how simple acts of kindness could transcend the usual boundaries of politics, sports, and celebrity. Local schools had already reached out to Shaq's foundation, asking if he would come speak to students about civic responsibility in helping others. 3 different Hollywood producers had called his agent about movie rights to the story. There were even rumors of a children's book in the works, The Big Diesel's Big Rescue. As the evening news cycles kicked in across different time zones, the story was being reported around the world. International media were particularly fascinated by this uniquely American tale. Where else could a basketball legend, a former First Lady, and a custom truck come together to create such a compelling narrative? Japanese news channels were running animated recreations of the drive to the hospital. British tabloids were speculating about the baby's name. Australian morning shows were debating whether Shaq's truck would fit through their notorious tight city lanes. Back at the hospital, Shaq had returned to the waiting room after his press conference. He was sharing stories with Charles Barkley and Donald Trump, an unlikely trio brought together by extraordinary circumstances. The conversation flowed easily between basketball memories, business deals, and funny stories about life in the public eye. "You know what's crazy?" Barkley mused, looking at his phone. "This story's got more viewers than Game 7 of the finals last year. And it's still growing." Trump nodded appreciatively. "That's because it's real, Charles. No script, no planning, just real people doing real things. That's what people want to see." Shaq was about to respond when Thompson, the head of security, entered the room with a look of excitement on his face. The moment they'd all been waiting for was approaching. The next few hours would add yet another chapter to this already remarkable story. The hospital corridor buzzed with anticipation as Thompson's news spread through the waiting area. The baby's arrival was imminent, and the energy in the room was electric. Shaq, who had faced countless high-pressure situations in his career, found himself feeling surprisingly nervous. "Never thought I'd be this invested in someone else's baby," he admitted to Charles Barkley, who had been keeping him company and providing comic relief throughout the evening. "I feel like I'm about to take a game-winning free throw." "Let's hope this has a better success rate," Barkley quipped, earning a playful shove that nearly sent him sprawling across the waiting room chairs. Outside, the scene had evolved into something resembling a peaceful festival. Local residents had brought lawn chairs and blankets, settling in to be part of the historic moment. Someone had set up a projector against the hospital's white wall, playing highlights of both Shaq's NBA career and Trump's memorable public moments. The crowd outside had grown more diverse as the evening progressed. Basketball fans mingled with political supporters, curious locals chatted with international tourists who had diverted their vacation plans just to be part of the story. The food trucks had been joined by local musicians, who were keeping the crowd entertained with gentle acoustic performances. Inside the hospital, Donald Trump was pacing the waiting room, occasionally checking his phone and smiling at the flood of messages from well-wishers. Despite his usual larger-than-life persona, he seemed more subdued now, showing the simple anxiety of any expectant father. "You know, Shaq," Trump said during one of his pacing loops, "I've closed billion-dollar deals with less nervousness than this." He paused, looking out the window at the gathered crowd. "But this is something else. And having you here, it's like fate had a plan all along." The hospital staff had adjusted remarkably well to the unusual circumstances. Nurses going about their regular duties and navigated around security personnel with practiced ease. One elderly patient, walking the halls for exercise, did a double-take at the sight of Shaq and Barkley playing paper basketball with wadded-up newspapers in the waiting room. Just then, Thompson reappeared in the doorway, this time with a broad smile that told everyone all they needed to know before he even spoke. Donald Trump froze mid-pace, and Shaq stood up so quickly he nearly knocked over a potted plant. "Mr. Trump," Thompson announced, "you have a healthy baby girl." The waiting room erupted in celebration. Trump's face lit up with a joy that had nothing to do with politics or business, pure, simple happiness of a father. He rushed forward to follow Thompson to the maternity ward, but not before turning to grab Shaq's massive hand in both of his. "Your family now, big man," he declared. "You're part of this story forever." As Trump disappeared down the hallway, Shaq felt his phone buzzing continuously. News of the birth was spreading faster than a fast break. The NBA commissioner had already tweeted congratulations, jokingly suggesting the baby should be made an honorary All-Star. The Miami Heat announced they would be hanging a tiny pink jersey in their arena. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers as the news spread. The musicians spontaneously broke into "Celebration" by Kool and the Gang, and the entire parking lot turned into an impromptu dance party. Hospital security had to remind excited well-wishers that there were other patients trying to rest. Social media platforms were practically melting down with the news. Memes were being created and shared at lightning speed, many featuring Shaq's truck with a stork riding shotgun. Twitter had to check if their servers could handle the volume of #BabyTrump and #ShaqDelivery tweets. Back in the waiting room, Shaq was doing his best to respond to the flood of messages from fellow athletes, celebrities, and friends. Michael Jordan had texted, "Not bad for an assist, big fella." Even Queen Elizabeth II's official account had posted congratulations, noting that special deliveries require special couriers. The hospital's PR team was working with both Trump's staff and Shaq's representatives to coordinate the official announcement. They decided to let the new parents have their private moment before sharing any details with the world. However, they did release one piece of information that sent social media into another frenzy: the baby's middle name would be Shakia. "Man, they didn't have to do that," Shaq said when he heard the news, genuinely touched by the gesture. Charles Barkley pretended to wipe away tears, saying, "Finally, a baby named after you, that's actually cute." The night shift nurses were changing over, but nobody wanted to leave. Each staff member felt they were part of something special, a story they would tell their grandchildren about. The cafeteria staff had started bringing up fresh coffee and snacks to the waiting area, refusing any payment from the gathered celebrities and media personnel. Local news helicopters continued to circle overhead, their spotlights creating an otherworldly atmosphere in the growing darkness. The crowd outside had thinned slightly but remained festive. Someone had started a pool predicting the baby's height, given her genetic connection to a former president and her honorary uncle being one of basketball's greatest players. Inside, Shaq was finally allowing himself to relax, the adrenaline of the day wearing off. He found himself thinking about how a simple decision to help someone in need had turned into something so much bigger. The world was different now, not in any grand political or social way, but in the small, personal ways that really matter. A young nurse approached him with a cup of coffee that looked tiny in his hands. "Mr. O'Neill," she said softly, "I just wanted to say, my brother's a firefighter, and he always says that the real test of a person is what they do when someone needs help. Today, you showed everyone what that means." Shaq accepted the coffee with a grateful nod, touched by the simple sincerity of her words. As he sipped the warm drink, he could hear the distant sounds of celebration from outside, the gentle bustle of the hospital around him, and the occasional burst of Charles Barkley's laughter as he retold the day's events to someone on his phone. In the maternity ward, a new family was having their first moments together, while outside, thousands of strangers were united in celebration. Somewhere in between, a basketball legend sat quietly, marveling at how life's biggest moments often come from its simplest decisions. As dawn broke over Miami, the hospital grounds had transformed into something resembling a combination of a basketball rally and a presidential campaign event. Early morning news crews were setting up their equipment, their tired faces showing they'd worked through the night. The story had only grown stronger with the sunrise. Inside, preparations were underway for the baby's first public appearance. Hospital staff had converted a small conference room into an impromptu press area, decorating it with a tasteful mix of pink balloons and flowers. Security teams from both the Trump Organization and the hospital worked in coordinated precision, ensuring every detail was perfect. Shaq, who had finally managed a few hours of sleep in a specially reinforced hospital recliner, was getting ready for his own part in the upcoming presentation. He had sent one of his assistants to bring him a fresh suit. He knew this moment would be photographed and remembered for years to come. "You clean up nice, big fella," Charles Barkley commented, himself looking surprisingly dapper in a suit he'd managed to source in the early hours. "Almost can't tell you spent the night in a waiting room." The morning had brought a fresh wave of reactions from around the world. The Pope had sent his blessings. Professional sports teams were sending custom baby jerseys. 3 different children's hospitals had called to ask if Shaq would consider a program where he drove expectant mothers in emergency situations. Donald Trump emerged from the maternity ward, looking simultaneously exhausted and elated. "Shaq," he called out, his voice carrying its usual energy despite the sleepless night. "We're almost ready. Wait until you see her, she's got your winning attitude already." The plan was simple but symbolic. Shaq would accompany the Trump family from the maternity ward to the conference room, completing the journey that had started with his emergency drive. The media would be allowed to capture this moment, but with strict guidelines to maintain the family's privacy and the hospital's decorum. As they waited for the final preparations, Shaq found himself in conversation with a hospital janitor who had worked through the night to keep the areas around the waiting room pristine. "You know," the janitor said, "I've worked here 20 years, seen all sorts of famous people come through, but I've never seen anything bring people together like this." The observation struck Shaq as particularly poignant. Looking out the window, he could see people from all walks of life still gathered outside. The crowd had developed its own sense of community overnight. Food was being shared, stories exchanged, and new friendships formed. Finally, the moment arrived. Melania emerged in a wheelchair, looking remarkably composed and elegant, holding a tiny pink bundle. Donald walked beside them, beaming with pride. As Shaq moved to join them, he was struck by how this unlikely group had become connected through circumstance and choice. The walk to the conference room was slow and dignified. Hospital staff lined the corridors, trying to maintain professional composure but unable to hide their smiles. One young doctor was unsuccessfully trying to pretend he wasn't recording the moment on his phone. As they entered the conference room, the assembled media fell silent for a moment before the cameras began clicking rapidly. The morning sun streamed through the windows, creating what photographers would later call perfect lighting for a perfect moment. Donald Trump stepped up to the microphone first. "Good morning, everyone. We're here to introduce someone very special. But first, I want to talk about another special person." He turned to Shaq. "Yesterday, this man didn't just drive my wife to the hospital, he showed us what America is all about. Coming together, helping each other, not asking questions about politics or beliefs, just being there for each other." Melania spoke next, her voice soft but clear. "We would like to introduce our daughter, Victoria Shakia Trump." She looked up at Shaq with a warm smile. "A strong name for a strong girl, inspired by someone who showed us true strength comes from helping others." The room erupted in applause and camera flashes. Baby Victoria, seemingly unimpressed by all the attention, continued sleeping peacefully. Shaq, standing behind the family, tried to discreetly wipe his eyes, though dozens of cameras caught the moment anyway. Outside, the crowd's cheers could be heard through the windows. The hospital had set up large screens in the parking lot, broadcasting the press conference live. People were hugging each other, caught up in the emotional moment. Social media platforms reported record-breaking engagement levels. The photos of Shaq with the Trump family were being shared millions of times per minute. Memes were already appearing, comparing baby Victoria's peaceful sleep to Shaq's famous sleep celebration after winning championships. The NBA commissioner called, officially declaring Shaq's drive to the hospital the most clutch assist in basketball history. The Miami Heat announced they would be retiring a tiny pink jersey with Shakia on the back, commemorating the day their legendary player made his most important delivery. Local officials, recognizing the historic nature of the event, were already discussing plans to place a commemorative plaque along the route Shaq had driven. The tunnel he had navigated so skillfully was being unofficially renamed Shaq's Squeeze by local residents. As the formal presentation concluded, Shaq found himself alone for a moment, watching the Trump family interact with the media. Charles Barkley appeared beside him, uncharacteristically serious. "You know what's crazy?" Barkley said quietly. "In all our years playing ball, all the championships, all the dunks, all the commercials, this might be the thing people remember most about you." Shaq nodded, understanding exactly what his friend meant. "Sometimes the best plays are the ones you never planned for," he replied, his voice thoughtful. The story was far from over. Already, there were talks of documentaries, books, and commemorative events. The hospital was fielding calls from medical schools wanting to study how they had managed such a high-profile event while maintaining patient care standards. Security experts were analyzing how the Trump team and hospital security had cooperated so seamlessly. But for now, in this moment, none of that mattered. A new life had entered the world, brought in under extraordinary circumstances that had somehow brought out the extraordinary in ordinary people. As Shaq watched baby Victoria's tiny hand grip her father's finger, he realized that some assists couldn't be measured in any statistical category. The morning sun continued to rise over Miami, its warm light touching the gathered crowd outside, the tired but happy hospital staff, the proud new parents, and the gentle giant who had helped make it all possible. In a world often divided by headlines, this was a story that had united people through its simple truth. Sometimes the biggest moments come from the simplest acts of kindness. The days following Victoria Shakia Trump's birth brought a wave of changes that nobody could have predicted. The story had taken on a life of its own, inspiring people in ways that transcended politics, sports, and celebrity culture. As Shaq prepared to leave the hospital, he found himself at the center of a movement he never intended to start. Early morning sunlight streamed through the hospital windows as Shaq gathered his belongings from the waiting room that had been his home for the past day and a half. Nurses stopped by to say goodbye, many sharing stories about how their own families had been touched by the events. "My son started a helpers club at his school yesterday," one nurse told him, showing Shaq a photo on her phone of elementary school kids wearing paper badges with his picture. "They're organizing to help other kids with homework and chores." all because they heard about what you did. Similar stories were popping up across the country. Social media was filled with #BeLikeShaq posts, showing people helping others in various ways, giving rides to stranded motorists, helping elderly neighbors with groceries, volunteering at local hospitals. The simple act of helping someone in need had sparked a nationwide movement. The hospital's administration had called an emergency meeting to handle the influx of donations that had started pouring in. People wanted to contribute to the maternity ward, inspired by the story. Plans were already being drawn up for a new emergency transport program, unofficially dubbed Shaq Squad, which would help ensure rapid transport for expectant mothers in crisis. Outside, the media presence had evolved. News trucks still lined the streets, but the reporting had shifted from celebrity coverage to human interest stories. Reporters were interviewing people from the crowd about their own experiences of receiving or giving help in times of need. Donald Trump had arranged for a special breakfast gathering in the hospital's private dining room. As Shaq entered, he found not just the Trump family, but also several surprise guests: the tunnel maintenance worker who had helped clear the way during the emergency drive, the food truck owners who had fed the crowd, and the young doctor who had been starstruck by Shaq's arrival. "These are the real heroes," Trump announced, gesturing to the gathered group. "Everyone who stepped up, did their part, made this story possible. Shaq may have started it, but look what you all did with it." Baby Victoria, nestled in Melania's arms, seemed to choose that moment to wake up, her tiny eyes opening to take in the scene. A collective "ah" filled the room, even from the typically stoic security personnel. "She's got your timing," Shaq joked to Trump. "Knows exactly when to steal the spotlight." The breakfast turned into an impromptu sharing session, with each person recounting their perspective of the events. The tunnel worker described how he'd received a call about a massive truck needing emergency passage and thought it was a prank until he saw Shaq's vehicle approaching. The food truck owners talked about how competing businesses had worked together to feed the crowd, sharing supplies and staff. Meanwhile, the impact continued to spread. The NBA announced a new community service initiative inspired by the events, encouraging players to be more involved in their local emergency services. Other sports leagues quickly followed suit. The NFL was already planning a special Emergency Services Appreciation Day, with Shaq as the honorary commissioner. Local government officials arrived at the breakfast with an unexpected proposal. They wanted to establish an annual Community Unity Day on the date of Victoria's birth. The idea was to encourage people to help others in their community, breaking down the barriers that often divided them. As the morning progressed, Shaq received a call from his mother. "Baby," she said, her voice full of emotion, "I always knew you were special, but this is what I always taught you about. This is what really matters." The call reminded Shaq of all the lessons his parents had taught him about responsibility and helping others. He shared these thoughts with the gathered group, speaking from the heart about how his mother, a single parent for many years, had always emphasized the importance of community support. Donald Trump, listening intently, suddenly stood up. "That's it," he declared with characteristic enthusiasm. "We're starting a foundation. The Victoria Shakia Foundation for Community Unity. Bringing people together, helping those in need, breaking down barriers. Shaq, I want you to be the honorary chairman." The idea caught fire immediately. Hospital administrators offered to help coordinate with other medical facilities. Local business owners pledged support. Even Charles Barkley, who had been unusually quiet during the breakfast, spoke up. "Finally, something Shaq can't mess up. Helping people is the only thing he's better at than me." As the morning wore on, plans began taking shape. The foundation would focus on emergency medical transport, community support programs, and breaking down social barriers through active community engagement. It would be non-political, non-partisan, focused solely on helping people in need. Social media exploded with the news. #Victoria Foundation started trending alongside #Shaq to the rescue. People were already asking how they could contribute, volunteer, or start local chapters in their communities. The hospital's PR team was working overtime to coordinate the various announcements. They had set up a special hotline just to handle the inquiries from people wanting to help or share their own stories of community support. As Shaq prepared to finally leave the hospital, he found himself surrounded by hospital staff, security personnel, and members of the media who had become part of the story themselves. Someone had arranged for a local children's choir to sing "Lean on Me," their young voices filling the hospital lobby. Before stepping out, Shaq turned to take one last look at the scene. The Trump family was posing for photos with hospital staff, baby Victoria still peaceful in her mother's arms. Charles Barkley was pretending to arm wrestle a security guard. Reporters were chatting with nurses, sharing stories and contact information. "You know," said Thompson, the head of security who had been there from the beginning, "when I first got the call about a basketball player driving a pregnant woman to the hospital, I thought it would be the craziest thing I'd ever deal with. Turns out it was just the beginning." Shaq smiled, thinking about how a simple decision to help had snowballed into something that was changing lives across the country. As he stepped out into the Miami sunshine, the gathered crowd erupted in cheers. Someone had made a banner that read, "Heroes come in all sizes." Looking at the diverse group of people before him, different ages, backgrounds, beliefs, all united in celebration of simple human kindness, Shaq realized that sometimes the biggest impacts come from the smallest decisions. All you had to do was be willing to help when help was needed. 1 month after the events that captured the world's attention, Miami's largest convention center was packed to capacity. The occasion? The official launch of the Victoria Shakiyah Foundation for Community Unity. The crowd was a living testament to how a single act of kindness could ripple outward, touching countless lives. Shaq stood at the podium, his massive frame dwarfing it as usual, but his presence today wasn't about physical size, it was about the magnitude of what had been accomplished in just 30 days. Behind him sat an unlikely alliance of supporters, the Trump family, including baby Victoria, now a month old and already showing signs of her mother's elegance, Charles Barkley, who had become the foundation's most enthusiastic promoter, and representatives from various community organizations across the country. "You know," Shaq began, his deep voice carrying easily across the hushed audience, "people keep asking me if I knew what would happen when I answered that phone call. Truth is, I wasn't thinking about making history or starting a movement. I was just thinking about someone who needed help." The foundation's first month had exceeded everyone's expectations. What had started as a simple idea had exploded into a nationwide network of community support. Local chapters had sprung up in cities across America, each adapting the core mission to their community-specific needs. The original Shaq Squad emergency transport program had already helped dozens of expectant mothers reach hospitals safely. The tunnel that Shaq had navigated so skillfully, now officially named the Unity Tunnel, had become a popular tourist spot, with visitors taking photos next to the commemorative plaque that read, "Where barriers were broken, and unity was born." Donald Trump took the stage next, holding baby Victoria, who was wearing a tiny custom-made dress with basketball patterns. "1 month ago," he began, "we thought we were just getting a new addition to our family. Instead, we got a new addition to the American story, a reminder that what makes us great isn't our differences, but our ability to come together when it matters." The Foundation's first major initiative was being announced today, a nationwide network of community response centers, combining emergency services with everyday support programs. The centers would be equipped with specialized vehicles, inspired by Shaq's famous truck, designed to help people in various crisis situations. Melania, who had become deeply involved in the Foundation's planning, shared her vision for the future. "We want to create places where people don't just come for help, but to help others. Where communities grow stronger together." Her words, delivered with genuine passion, reflected how deeply the experience had affected her own perspective on community service. The media coverage had evolved from simple celebrity news to serious reporting on community development and social unity. Major networks had dedicated segments to covering the Foundation's projects, highlighting successful initiatives and sharing stories of lives changed through community support. Charles Barkley couldn't resist adding his own touch of humor to the proceedings. "You know what's really crazy," he said during his speech. "Shaq finally found something he's better at than basketball, bringing people together. And trust me, that's saying something, because he was pretty good at basketball, almost as good as me." The laughter that filled the convention center was warm and genuine, reflecting how the story had maintained its human touch despite its growing scale. In the audience, many of the original participants from that first day were present: the hospital staff, the tunnel worker, the food truck owners, all now part of something much bigger than themselves. Local businesses had embraced the Foundation's mission with unexpected enthusiasm. The food trucks that had fed the crowd during Victoria's birth had formed a network of mobile food providers, ready to support community events and emergency situations. Hotels had pledged rooms for families needing emergency accommodation. Even competing companies had found ways to work together for the common good. The Foundation's youth programs were particularly successful. Schools across the country had incorporated community service projects inspired by the Big Assist, as Shaq's original rescue had come to be known. Children were learning that heroism wasn't just about spectacular acts, but about being willing to help when help was needed. As the launch event continued, videos played on massive screens showing the Foundation's impact across the country. Emergency transports in rural areas, community cleanup projects in cities, support programs for elderly residents, each project a branch growing from that single seed planted on a hot Miami afternoon. Baby Victoria, now being gently rocked by her mother, seemed to take in the scene with unusual interest for a 1-month-old. "She's got that look," Shaq commented during a quiet moment. "The same look your security guy had when he called me that day, like she's planning something big." The Foundation had already secured funding for the next 5 years, with contributions pouring in from corporations, private donors, and everyday citizens. But more importantly, it had secured something far more valuable: the active participation of communities across the nation. As the event drew to a close, Shaq shared one final story that brought everything full circle. "Yesterday," he said, "I got stuck in traffic. Nothing serious, just a flat tire. Before I could even call for help, 3 different cars stopped. Nobody knew me as Shaq the basketball player, or Shaq from the rescue story. They just saw someone who needed help, and they stopped. That's what this is all about." The Foundation's motto, displayed prominently behind the stage, summed up the spirit of everything that had happened: unity through action. It wasn't just about helping people in emergencies, it was about creating a continuous chain of support, where today's helpers might be tomorrow's helped, and vice versa. As the crowd began to disperse, Shaq found himself surrounded by the original group from the hospital. They took a photo together: the basketball legend, the Trump family, the medical staff, the security team, all gathered around baby Victoria. It would become the Foundation's unofficial symbol, a reminder of how a simple act of helping could bring together the most unlikely group of people. The Miami sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors as people left the convention center, each carrying with them not just memories of an event, but a renewed commitment to their communities. Shaq stood at the entrance, shaking hands and sharing words with people as they left, his famous smile as bright as ever. "You know what the best part is?" he said to Charles Barkley as the last attendees departed. "This story isn't ending, it's just beginning. Every time someone helps someone else, it gets a new chapter." As night fell over Miami, the lights of the convention center dimmed, but the light of what had been started there continued to spread, one act of kindness at a time. The story of a basketball legend, a former First Lady, and a baby named Victoria had become something more: a reminder that in a world often divided by headlines, we are all united by our capacity to help each other. And somewhere in the city, a custom truck stood ready for its next rescue, a symbol of how the biggest journeys often start with the simplest decision to help.